Hello. So I'm going to start setting up Warcraft here, and the first thing I want to do is do my graphics settings, and I like to run at higher settings than the in-game menus will allow you to set. So I'm just going to run through a few sort of higher than ultra settings you can configure. Before you even log into Warcraft, you should come into Program Files, Warcraft WTF, or wherever it is you've installed Warcraft, and look in your WTF folder, and you'll have your config.wtf file. And at the very beginning, you can add this line here, set spell effect level, and then anything you want can go after that, any number bigger than 0. I think the default is something like 10. And what that does is it controls the amount of missiles and particle effects in AoE abilities. So I'm just going to come down here and let's say something like slash console spell effect level 10. I think this is roughly the default. And I'm just going to cast a blizzard somewhere out here. There we go. So not terribly impressive. If you have a really crummy computer, or you find AoE is really distracting, maybe you want to set that even lower than default, but I want mine jacked up nice and high. You can set this as high as you want, but it's going to kill your frame rate if you go too high. For example, 5,000 is pretty over the top. Here you go. So if there's boss abilities that you have a hard time avoiding, maybe you want to set them super high, but realistically that's just going to kill your frame rate. I like to set mine to something around 125, 150, something like that. You get a pretty impressive looking AoE effect, but not so much that you get a slideshow if you're in a 25-man raid and people just start spamming their AoEs. It's also really useful for abilities like Death and Decay, where sometimes the shape of the ground causes that rune it puts to be like cropped or hidden or not rendered properly. It makes the particle effects really potent, and so it's very easy to see it even though the rune is invisible because of the shape of the floor. The next setting I want to talk about is ground effect clutter. So if you look around, we have the grass here, and this is the standard ultra settings, and it looks decent enough, but you can actually go slightly higher than that. There are two console commands that control it. There is the ground effect density, which controls how much grass there is, and then there's ground effect dist or fade. There are two different ways of controlling apparently the same thing, which is how far out it renders. So this looks all right, and I'm just going to jack this up to 256. The default on Ultra is 128, so you can actually go quite a bit higher. And I'm just going to hit enter and paste this in, and there we go. And you can see that the grass got much more intense. Just to switch it back to, say, 128. So turn back. Next one is probably easier to see if we just fly. So I'm going to mount up. And here we go. So I'm going to maybe zoom into first person. And let's see. Yeah, so if you look right up along here, just between these two trees, you can see the edge of the ground effect. It might not show up too well on YouTube, but right here is basically the edge of where these ground effect grasses and whatnot are being drawn. Now you can set the distance to roughly double what Ultra gives you. So right now we're about here, and if I paste in 600, you can see it goes way off to the distance over here. And it's kind of noticeable when you're flying around. Things just look a lot nicer. Now, if you look far enough in the distance, you can see that it's still kind of smoothed out. The grass has faded away. But especially when you're down on the ground, it looks way nicer. You don't have the grass effects just kind of popping into view over the hills. So, I don't know, a couple of interesting settings. They do have a pretty big impact on your frame rate, so you might want to take it easy. I find that this will knock down my frame rate to under 60 sometimes in the new zones, and I have pretty powerful hardware. This is like a 3770K or something like that, and a 7970 gigahertz edition graphics card, so it's pretty reasonable hardware for Warcraft. And if I set these up, I just can't maintain a solid 60 FPS in every outdoor environment. So something to keep in mind. If you've got maybe better hardware than I do, you might want to jack it up and just see how it goes. You can always just scroll it back down. The defaults are 128 on Ultra for the density and 260 for the distance. There's another setting, Ground Effect Fade, which seems to do the same thing as Ground Effect Dist, but the numbers are twice as big. I don't know what the deal is there. It's not really documented anywhere. You can see a slight change when you set it, but as far as I can tell, it's basically the same thing. Next up, if we look at the sky, how can I do it without getting... Maybe I should turn down that clutter. Oh no, there we go. There's some clouds. So we have these cloud effects, and we can control that with a setting called Sky Cloud LOD. I think the default is 0, but you can set that up to an integer value from 0 to 3. So if I set this to 1, and see that's sort of the... Actually, I think 0 is the default. You can see things are super intense. There's not a lot of variation, though. It's kind of plain. If you set this up to a higher value, you can see there's more variation. It's kind of more intense here and less intense here. The highest setting you can go is 3, and it just makes things, I think, a little more interesting, a little more detailed, because there's more going on up there. It's not as noticeable in the new zones because we have the really fancy skyboxes, but if you're out here in the middle of nowhere, it's kind of nice. Just a little bit more detailed. The other thing I want to talk about is the far clip setting. So by default on Ultra, your far clip I think is set to 1250 or 1300, something like that. I can do /run print. What the heck is the command? Get cvar, I think. Far clip. Run. I guess not. Oh, maybe. Oh yeah, there it is. 1300. I'm ignoring a whisper because I'm a douchebag. So yeah, that's the view distance slider, which is in your standard system interface here. View distance. And 1300 is the maximum that you can set up by sliders. But you can actually go slightly further than that. There was a blue post where one of the developers mentioned that you can actually set it to 1600. And when you do that, the game stops being limited by 1300 and starts adjusting automatically to render as far as it can. He didn't really clarify what that means. It certainly won't let it go out to like 9,000, but if you are playing, especially on really wide screens, you do tend to get slightly further rendering distances at like the periphery of your screen. So if you do something like console spell effect, slash console bar clip 1600, then you'll see that it's slightly harder or slightly further rendering distance. Because of the way fogging works, it's actually not super noticeable when you're looking at things straight on. Like if you notice out here, it just kind of blacks out. But if you tilt sideways, you can see that you can actually see more detail when you're not looking straight at it. And that's just the way Warcraft calculates fog. If you're playing on like an iFinity setup or NV Surround, it's really noticeable at the edges of your screen. Like if you are, say, watching a large open boss room, you can actually see things all the way off to the edges. The fogging isn't as noticeable when you're looking straight at something. I don't know if you've got the graphics card or the CPU power to spare, why not do it, right? One more setting that I'm going to quickly mention is FFX Glow. And this used to be a setting in Classic in the standard game menu, but then they just turned it on by default. And some people think that Warcraft is kind of super bright or kind of cartoony. And you can turn this setting off, and it'll sort of mute the colors a little bit. So there we go. You can see it's just a little more washed out. Some people will think it looks a little more realistic. To each his own. I just figured I'd mention it because I'm doing graphic settings. I'm going to turn it back on, and you'll see things brighten up a little bit. And I don't know, I figured that's kind of interesting. There's a related effect, FFX Death, which has to do when you're dead and running around as a corpse. Some people say that it affects frame rates, but really if you're running as a corpse or doing a corpse run, you're running as a ghost. I don't think that frame rate really matters there. Anything else? I guess we can talk about colorblind mode. So Warcraft, somewhere buried in the help. I don't really know how to find it. Colorblind. No, I guess not. Somewhere in here anyway, apparently there's a link to the colorblind settings. And Warcraft has built-in sort of color correction for if you have color blindness. There's half a dozen, and if you Google for it, you'll find it. But you can also just kind of turn it on to look pretty. Slash console. What is it? Color blind shader. And I'm going to copy that so I don't have to type it. So there are a handful. You can just kind of step through and see them. I imagine that these would look better or worse if you were actually colorblind. But if you're doing maybe an intro for a video and you wanted maybe like a black and white effect, you can hit 7 and get a cool black and white. Or if you wanted something maybe washed out and old timey, you could do like, I think 1. It's kind of muted. You can just play with them, get kind of cool effects, which might be nice for like, I don't know, a video or something. You don't want to like post-production it in After Effects or Premiere or whatever it is you use to do your video editing. So I figured I'd point that out. You can turn it off by just setting shader effects 0. And if you Google for it, you can find the vision ailments or whatever you want to call them that it corrects for. I just don't really know much about color blindness. The last thing I want to talk about is the FPS settings. Now, if you just render as fast as you can, you'll often get screen tearing. It's not going to show up because I'm recording with a crummy video capture thing. And a way people tend to fix it is to just enable VSync. You come in, you hit VSync enabled, and it'll sync the frame rate to your screen's refresh rate. So these are 60 hertz screens. It'll render 60 frames a second. If you don't have a very powerful graphics card and a very powerful CPU, you might find that in like a 25-man RAID, you can't keep up with a 120 hertz monitor. I don't think there's any hardware where you can do ultra graphics 25-man rating and still hold down 120 frames per second. So you might want to set it down to something like 60 frames a second so that it's sort of an even multiple of your refresh rate. Either way, if you don't want tearing, VSync is normally the way you do it. But I find that when I'm doing Fraps or DxTory, I often get some sort of like a micro stutter. I noticed it when I was using Crossfire, and I assume that people who use SLI setups might also notice it. The game will say you're getting, say, 150 frames a second, but you can feel, it's sort of like the game is surging. It's really hard to describe, but you'll feel it when you're playing, and it just looks wrong. The solution I found to that, at least for me, is if I come into advanced, there's these max foreground FPS settings. And if I enable that, and then I do something like slash console max FPS 60. There we go. We can see I come down here. It sets my frame rate slightly above my refresh rate, so 60 frames a second. And it tends to stay there. And when I'm doing recording, I don't have the issues where I get the micro stutter, or if maybe some sort of like surge of AOE happens and I just can't keep up with 60 frames a second and I drop a few frames. I find that the way the recording looks after that ends up just being more smooth appearing than if I have VSync enabled. So it's something to consider if you do a lot of recording and playing with. You might want to check it out and try it and see if it helps you. The last thing I want to do is violence level, and I can't do it on my mage, so I'm going to switch over quickly to my DK. Alright, so I'm on my DK, and I'm going to go find some bad guys to kill. Looks like there's someone out here questing or something. Here we go. So there's a setting here called violence level. Slash console violence level 0. And it controls blood effects when you melee things. So I've set it to 0 now, which should give me green blood. If I hit this dude, Death Strike, you can see he kind of bleeds out green there. And there's a handful of different settings you can enter there. It takes any integer from 0 to 5. So I should probably copy this. So console violence level, Control A, Control C. If I set it to 1, I'll get black blood. Where's a guy here? Maybe. There we go. A little harder to see because we're in a weird place, but maybe there. There we go. And I think these exist for maybe like the Chinese or the Korean clients. I'm pretty sure that China has issues with like death themes. I know that the undead models, for example, are different in the Chinese client than they are in the North American and European ones. And I assume that maybe because they can't show things like skulls or skeletons, and I think tombstones are on the cursed list. They might also have this setting here to control blood. Maybe it's just for like PG-13 settings or parental controls, but either way, it's an option in there. And I think 3 is the standard for the Western client, where you just get like the regular red blood that you're familiar with. Looks sort of normal, but you can actually set it to something a little bit higher, where you'll get all of the different colors at the same time. So if I set this to violence level 5, I should get green, black, and red blood. And it's kind of a pain in the butt to test because the spell effects it randomly selects how intense it's going to be, but here we go. So you kind of might have noticed it there. It's hard to say. But either way, 5 is the highest setting, and there doesn't seem to be an in-game control for it. So if you're interested in getting your settings as high as humanly possible, that's one more one you can tweak.